Good evening and welcome to Policy Exchange for what is an 8th event on growth, taxing for growth. You'll notice that's potentially, some would argue, an oxymoron that taxing and growth can't really go in the same format, in the same sentence. But actually, I think tax is essential for the UK economy. We need to have tax to fund public services, and the key question is, how can we have that tax which is essential, and how can we levy it in a way which causes potentially least damage to the economy? And that's, I think, hopefully where we're going to be focusing tonight. First, a bit about me. I'm Matt Oakley. I head up the Economics and Social Policy Unit at Policy Exchange. I should confess now that I'm a huge tax geek. My previous life was at the Treasury, where I started my career working in property taxation. It has to be said that going into the Treasury was a great thing for me, so I was really pleased when I found out I'd be going to the Treasury on the government fast stream for economists. Then I found out I was going to be working in property tax. I definitely thought twice about whether actually this would be the right thing or not. Over the next few years, actually, I found out that tax was really interesting. It affects all of us. It affects the whole country, it affects growth, it affects people's living standards, and most of all, it's hugely politically interesting. And so, I think just the turnout here tonight actually does reflect how interesting a subject it is, and also the stellar cast of speakers we have. And thankfully, none of you had two heads and looked too scary, so it's actually quite surprising. So, as speakers, actually not as speakers, but it's actually a bit more context. So, you've heard that we've had 7 or 8 events on growth so far. I know that some of you have been. Hopefully you've all seen the autumn statement, our autumn statement looking to the future of growth, which we published shortly before the government's own autumn statement last week. That focused on a huge range of issues, outlining how we thought the government should stop, or government and indeed the opposition should stop looking at short-term GDP figures, stop looking at quarterly figures, and start looking to the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and looking to see how we get from where we are into something much more productive and a much faster growing economy. And I think tax has a really large part to play here. And one of the key areas I'd like to pull out a little bit tonight is whether it's tax levels and rates which make a difference, or whether it's tax certainty and tax predictability which make business decisions easier. So that trade-off between lowering rates and keeping rates stable over a longer period of time. Some of the questions I've asked the speakers to consider, the obvious one, what impact does tax have on growth? How is the coalition doing? Have the tax reforms been right? We've had an announcement this week around the publication of the draft finance bill. So is that good? I'm sure there'll be some mixed views there. Obviously, we've got now the Office of Tax Simplification. How's that going, and what should the future role be? And similarly, along similar lines, is tax competition from abroad a real threat, or should we be looking to reduce rates fast and keep pace with our competitors, or are there wider issues which need to be considered? That's probably enough from me, so I'd like to introduce our panel. We have David Gauke, Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury and MP for South West Hertfordshire. Paul Johnson, behind me, who is Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. John Whiting, the Tax Director of the Office of Tax Simplification. And finally, Will Morris, Senior International Tax Counsel and Director, European Tax, General Electric. So I'm sure you're aware, a great cast of speakers, and so I'll leave it over to them. I think they'll have 5 minutes each to kick off, and then we'll open up to a discussion. And I'd like to ask Paul to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Matt. I don't know actually whether you count as a tax geek yet. When you consider the amount of time some of us have spent being tax geeks, I think you've still got an apprenticeship to serve. There are certainly some of us who get terribly excited about it, and have indeed spent, in my case, more years than I care to think, just doing one particular project on tax, which is the production of the Merleys Review, which came out a few months ago, which was an effort to look at the tax system in the round and talk about some of the things that you might want to do to change the structure of the tax system to make it more efficient. I want to say just a couple of things about tax and growth. I mean, the first is the obvious, which is that tax takes 40% or so of national income. So £4 in every 10 that's earned goes in tax. It is clearly the way that it is structured going to have an impact on the output of the economy, both in the in a static sense and in the dynamic sense in terms of change over time. So the structure, the way we structure taxes is a very, very big impact, inevitably, over the long term on growth. I'm not going to talk about the level of taxes, just the structure of taxes must matter if you're taking £4 in every 10 in the economy into it. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. We have big discussions on education and health and social security and defence and transport and all the other bits of government, and all those are really important. But tax is as big as all of those put together by definition, or at least it isn't quite at the moment, but it ought to be. So it really does matter. Now, in terms of thinking about tax and growth, what I'm not going to talk about, and what I don't think we should be thinking about, is what can you do by way of tax reliefs and tax incentives to help one bit of the economy or one type of business or one sort of driver of growth over others. Because I think by far the biggest impact that tax has on growth is in the way that it impacts on people's behaviour and company behaviour generally, and the incentives that the structure of the system creates. So the first part of that is clearly where is it going to have an impact on growth and on economic activity? Well, there are many places, but three big places where you expect that. One clearly is on corporate behaviour and investment, and the structure of the corporate tax system will impact on corporate decisions and the way that the corporate tax system relates to corporate systems internationally, but also the extent to which corporate tax taxes the normal return to investment activity will reduce corporate investment. And we do currently have a corporate tax system which taxes the normal return to investment activity, and you would expect that to have a negative impact on growth, or at least on the level of activity in the economy. It is possible to construct a system in a way that is only taxing supernormal returns or returns above the normal return, and that would undoubtedly help growth. You would need then to levy taxes elsewhere. So an important part of the whole construct, of course, is that it's not the case that companies pay tax. Every individual, if you have corporate tax, individuals are paying tax in the end, whether it be the shareholders, the employees, or the customers. And getting the debate about tax right is very important. You can improve the tax system whilst keeping its current level of progressivity without worrying too much about exactly where the individual taxes are coming from. So investment is one area. Employment is a second crucial area. We know that the tax system has an impact on people, on the likelihood, first of all, the likelihood of people going to work at all, and secondly, on the number of hours that they work. Now, that likelihood of going to work at all is probably the most important impact that the tax system has, and there are particular groups on which it has an effect. Those over the age of about 55, the tax and welfare system has an enormous effect on the likelihood of them going to work. We have a low level of labour market participation by that group, and that's directly related to the structure of the tax and benefit system. The same is true particularly of mothers with school-aged children. Frankly, the tax system doesn't make much difference at all to men of my age, between 25 and 55. Basically, 90% in all countries of men of that age go to work. So you can construct the tax system to affect different people differently because of what you know about the way that they behave. The third element of its impact on growth or economic activity is the way that the tax system treats saving, which is what you need to save in order for companies to invest. And to the extent that the tax system currently discriminates against saving, it's bad in the long run for the productive potential of the economy. And then there are a whole series of more general issues around the way that the tax system, how complex the tax system is, where there are diversions from neutrality in the tax system, which creates different behaviour by people, which reduces their welfare. So we have a whole series of examples of that. We have VAT exemptions for parts of the economy, particularly financial services, which create distortions in the economy. We have VAT, reduced rates of VAT on some, and zero rates of VAT on some good, which change the way that people behave in terms of what they consume. We know that that has an impact on economic welfare. We have a very inefficient system of taxing road transport. Government reviews have shown that fairly convincingly, I think, you can increase both economic activity and welfare by moving from the system of taxation of petrol we have to one of congestion charging. And indeed, we're going to have to do that if we're, as we expect, if we're going to move towards much lower levels of petrol consumption on cars. And we know that tax has a really significant effect on housing and therefore people's mobility across the country. And the current system of housing taxation, including stamp duty, is a mess and creates significant economic distortions and is a brake on growth. And it's very hard to put numbers to some of these things, but you can put numbers to some of them, and when you do, those are big numbers. So there are, I'll just conclude by saying that at the end of the work that we did for the Merleys review, the conclusion that we came to, and this isn't a set of principles we started with, but it's a conclusion we came to, was that you really need to think about three things when you're thinking about the tax system as a whole. The first and most important, actually, is you need to think about the tax system as a whole. The way that it fits together really matters. If you tax companies and self-employed people and individuals differently, you create a lot of tax-driven behaviour, and there is a lot of tax-driven behaviour in terms of whether people are self-employed or employees or incorporated. And there have been, you know, as most of you know, been some dreadful mistakes around that made around tax policy making in that area. So the first thing is should we create the system as a whole? The second is, unless you've got a very, very good reason to deviate from neutrality, let's have a neutral tax system, one that behaves similarly towards similar kinds of activities. If you start doing things differently for similar activities, that creates complexity, it creates avoidance opportunities, and it creates inefficiency. Now, there are some places, where environmental taxes, for example, and tax on alcohol, where you want to deviate from that, but you need a very big, you need a big hurdle before you get there. And one of my worries about tax policy making under all governments is that hurdle is nowhere near big enough. Relatively small potential gains are seen as good reasons for deviating in big ways from neutrality, and actually the cost of that can be very large. And the third principle is clearly you want a tax system which is progressive. You can determine, take your own view about how progressive it is, but you want progressivity in an efficient way. We currently have a progressive tax system, but one is progressive in a very inefficient way, both in the sense that we use things like the VAT system to create progressivity. That's a very inefficient way of creating progressivity, but also we have one that's progressive in a way which is significantly detrimental to the work incentives of people on low earnings. So a progressive, neutral, efficiently progressive, neutral tax system is something that we should aim at and which will be good for growth, but one that we're still some considerable way away from, not least because actually of the way that we make policy on tax. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I think you kind of highlighted some of the key problems and challenges in the tax system there. And for anybody who hasn't actually read the Merleys review, I really would commend them to do so. It's, I was saying earlier, it's given the breadth and the scale of the areas it covers, it really is an interesting read. So do go home tonight and have a read. John, can you try and tackle some of those issues and perhaps talk about the work of the ATS?
I will do my best, and I suppose I better start by confessing to being a tax geek, or I usually call myself a tax anorak. In my day job, I'm with the Chartered Institute of Taxation, which of course is the professional body for tax anoraks, so think that as it may. As Paul said, tax and growth, you can't disentangle them, can you? Because let's face it, if you didn't take money from businesses through tax, they have more to grow with, invest, etc., etc. But it'd be, although it's very tempting for the OTS to say a great simplification would just be to abolish all business taxes, which a lot of businesses would vote for. I suspect it's probably not going to be very popular with David and the rest of the government, because it does have certain revenue implications. So let's be serious. We want to accept that taxes are there, but it's the question, as Paul has alluded to, is how should those taxes be levied? People would rather pay less. Nobody's going to object to paying less, but actually, certainly as far as business is concerned, a lot of the messages one gets is that they want to pay clear amounts. They want to pay amounts that they know are the case, settle, move on, because they've got better things to do, like grow or go to bed, or something like that. So my point, certainly, and I think it's something that the OTS has picked up a lot, is taxes fundamentally shouldn't get in the way first do no harm, if you like, or as harking back to Adam Smith, who talked about easy taxes. Now, I've got to be careful in saying easy taxes, because that suddenly conjures up visions of all tax returns being orange or something like that, which I don't think is what he meant. But there's a very serious point in there, which is that taxes should be easy to manage, easy to deal with. And that's really what I want to talk a bit about on the work that the OTS has done, because we've done quite a lot of work on small business in particular. That is continuing, particularly looking at the problems small businesses have with the tax system, the administration in particular. And the report, some of you may have seen the report we did in the spring. There'll be more, which probably won't be quite as big as Merley's, but gripping read nonetheless. It comes up with some very interesting points, the problems that small business have. And the top three are definitely in the top three order. And the biggest problem they have is just the sheer volume of change. Then they cited the problems that the PAYE NIC systems give them, and the third is HMRC admin. And although I'm talking about small businesses, I suspect they'll resonate equally with most large businesses. And I'll say a word about those three, because I think they all have resonances for growth. So, change, that was the biggest thing. The sheer volume of change creates complexity because it creates distraction, it creates uncertainty. Now, I was showing a platform with Paul Morton, who's tax director of Reed Elsevier the other day, and I made the same point. He said he had to declare an interest because as the publishers of Tolley's Yellow and Orange book, they had a distinct interest in this. But putting them to one side, fundamentally, if there is less change, then the system automatically gets simpler, it's more stable, there's more time, there's more cost to concentrate on the business. Now, we know things can't just be flat and simple, that they have to change and evolve. Life changes. But of course, the message there is do so by steady evolution consultation, not imposition. And to give an example of that, let's do one from a few years ago. The sudden cancellation of industrial buildings allowances, hotel allowances and the like, didn't do a lot to encourage people to invest because it gave a feeling that the system's capricious, things would change. So in many ways, one of the things that I think is one of the best things that so far the Coalition has done is the tax policy making document and the ideas there that things should evolve steadily. Let's manage change. The second I mentioned, PAYE NIC. It's complex, it causes difficulties, it causes distortions. It does, I mean, Paul's alluded to it to a degree, but it starts to influence the way people are hired and they work, and that must be daft. It causes too many problems. Now again, very good that we've started, I like to think, at least in part as a result of the OTS work, to look at bringing those two levies together. I don't think we'll ever get them into one single levy, that will be impractical, but the closer we can get them together, moving in step, it removes problems, removes distortions, got great potential, and leaving business freer to concentrate on what it should be doing. The third, I mentioned HMRC admin. We're doing a lot more work on that, but the key thing there that came through is harking back to what I said. What business wants to know is what is the tax bill, can I settle it, can I get finality, can I get certainty, closure. And that is the great message that a lot of businesses gave us. That's what the system should give us, and too often it doesn't. Too often it leaves them worried that something may change. That detracts from confidence to invest and grow. One example on that comes through a lot, VAT, very popular tax of course, but it was quite striking how much we've heard that smaller businesses, as they're trying to grow, have to trade abroad. Well, that's good, isn't it? But of course they immediately bump into another VAT system. Now we all know that we have a harmonised VAT system around Europe, and it's the same wherever you go, isn't it? Except possible slight differences in language. Well, yeah, you all guess it. It isn't. It causes problems, and one of the best things that smaller businesses trying to grow like is to help, get help with how to adapt and how to manage VAT as they try and buy and sell abroad. So there's a few thoughts from the OTS and some of the things we've been looking at. A couple of the things that I think Matt asked me to talk about. So those help. Thank you.
Actually, one of the nice things about going third is that almost everything that should have been said has been said by now. And in fact, having an economist and a government professional make business's case for it is very pleasant. So thank you both very much for that. In terms of growth, I actually participated in PX's autumn statement booklet. And instead of writing, I think what people expect me to write, which was we'd like money for this, and we'd like money for that, and we'd like money for the other, I did actually talk about what these guys are talking about. Part of this is about predictability and certainty. It's about knowing where you're going. Business makes decisions based on a time frame, an investment window, and whether it's 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, it's going to be somewhere in that range. And you will build that into your plan. And the more often that that plan delivers, I mean, there are going to be other things which change. There are going to be all sorts of things that change. I mean, we are in a very different place than we were 5 years ago. But if there are avoidable things which change, particularly the tax system, that is going to have an effect on investment going forward. And that in turn obviously is going to have an effect on growth. So predictability and certainty are important. How do you get there? One of the things that I said in this article is, and again, I think Paul said this, things change. When things change, so it's not that everything has to remain static, but it's how do you manage that change? What is the process for change? Is there a predictable process for change? And one of the things that John talked about was this tax policy making document that David, it's a great document, put out a year last June, followed through on in many ways. It begins to put a process around tax policy making, a process which in some respects has become broken because of the way that responsibility had moved from HMRC to the Treasury. But it puts this process around it. What is the policy? Quite often, over the past 10 or 15 years, a change has been made and the policy has been made up after that. And you think, that doesn't quite seem to be the right way around. How do we want to think about this? So it's thinking about policy first. But we also need to look at other things. Simplicity is another of those words which gets used. Not everybody means it. Quite often people will trade a pound of simplicity for a penny of benefit. But that's not always true. And one of the things that we were just talking about before is all the draft clauses came out yesterday. There has been a lot of work done on the CFC regime, Controlled Foreign Company regime, how the profits of UK companies, UK-owned companies, doing business overseas, how they're taxed. We've made a huge amount of movement. I came back from the US this morning. A long time ago, I worked for the US Treasury. And I was in Washington, and we had 2 days of talks about tax policy reform in Washington. To come back to the UK, at least under those circumstances, was a breath of fresh air. It is a fundamentally dysfunctional system. Here we have a system which works, in large part. We have business talking to government. We have government talking to the advisors. We have everybody essentially trying to move in the same direction. And again, growth isn't necessarily about certainly not about picking winners and losers. It's not about putting money into things. But it is ensuring that the system doesn't get in the way of growth, doesn't get in the way of job creation, doesn't get in the way of what business really wants to do, which is to make more money, and therefore employ more people, and therefore pay more taxes, and grow us out of the situation that we're in. That's what business wants to do. And the system in this country is sort of moving in that direction. Are we there yet? No, not completely. I did say to David, I had a slight sinking feeling when I opened the draft clauses on CFCs today, which stretched to about 130 pages. And, we talked about these very simple principles which were going to get people out, which as it turns out are buried on, I think, page 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, something like that, and then stretch on for 10 pages. And you're looking for those words that you're sort of expecting to see there, and they're not there. So could we do better? Yes, we could do. But have we done pretty well? Actually, yes, we have done. And the tax policy making system in this country, I think, works better than almost any other country I've seen. And I would give huge credit for that, particularly to this government, although to be fair, it did start moving under the last government as well. So that's what business is looking for, is looking for a process which can manage change. Because, you know, the situation is different from a year ago. The situation a year ago is different from 2 years before that. How do we manage that? If we put a process about it so that there can be the correct input into that, then we have the possibility for growth. There are a whole series of other things that I could talk about, and I'm not going to, because I think I've probably had my 5 minutes. But I'm sure there are going to be lots of Q&As about what's going on in Brussels, and what about infrastructure, and what about HMRC, so I'll leave that for the Q&A.
Chance to respond to some of those challenges there. It seems to be a report kind of done okay, could do better so far, so how are you going to do better?
Well, that's, by the standards of most politicians, that's often as good as it gets. There we go. Well, first of all, I should declare that I'm not a tax geek. I suppose I've been doing the job in opposition and in government for about 4 years now, so maybe I'm an aspiring tax geek. In fact, my wife is a tax lawyer, so I can't even claim to be the biggest tax expert in my family. But I have to say, I developed an enthusiasm for tax policy because I think it is hugely important. I think Paul put his finger on it when he said that you know, it's 40% of GDP, and therefore it should be seen as hugely important. In fact, I was speaking to an audience of HMRC officials a couple of weeks ago, and I pointed out that there were something like 20 government departments and 100 government ministers who devoted their lives to spending money, and there was one government department and pretty well one government minister responsible for bringing the money in, so that we made up about half of government. Maybe that's the sort of egocentric view that you expect from a politician. But of course, tax is hugely important in terms of growth. It is vitally important that if we're going to get the growth that this economy needs, that we have the incentives for enterprise and investment, that we ensure that tax doesn't cause an inefficient allocation of resources. And it is important to look at this increasingly on an international basis, because competitiveness matters. You know, what we do is not just in absolute terms, it's in relative terms as well. And in recent years, we've seen some of our competitive advantages diminish. Traditionally, for example, we had a low corporation tax rate. So traditionally, in sort of the changes that Nigel Lawson brought through. In '97, we were in quite a good place on that front, and that diminished over the years that followed. So it is right that we try to address some of those points. But before turning to some of the things that we've done as a government, it is also worth pointing out some of the constraints that exist. And the first and the biggest of this is, of course, we have the most enormous deficit. The most depressing point about looking at our tax system is to see quite how much money we collect off people, the overall tax burden we impose upon people, and realise that it doesn't go nearly enough to cover the spending that government makes. It means that there were no easy opportunities to be able to throw money at particular things, to forego revenue, as I should say, because we had that big deficit. Indeed, we took the view that we needed to increase the tax burden, which we did largely through VAT, as a contribution towards reducing the deficit. It does have to be said that increasing taxes is something that you can do relatively quickly compared to spending. But I would stress the point that most economists and most economic studies in this area argue that if you're doing a big fiscal consolidation, it should be public spending cuts, not tax increases, that should bear the biggest burden, and that ideally one should have an 80-20 split. And if you look at the overall 80% going towards spending cuts, and if you look at the overall package over the 6 years now, indeed we have a 79-21% split in favour of public spending. So the government has recognised rightly that we cannot tax our way out of dealing with this deficit, but the focus has to go on public spending. We also have to recognise that we have to bring the public with us when we are taking some very difficult decisions on public spending, when there are pay freezes, when there are cuts in welfare, cuts in budgets for most government departments. We have to recognise some of the sensitivities that exist and the need for the public to support what we're doing. For example, the 50p rate of income tax. Most economists, I think, would argue that a marginal rate of, in fact, 52% on top income for people who are often very mobile is not what you would do, but we recognise the difficulty in cutting that. We have asked HMRC to undertake a study to see what revenue it is actually bringing in, and we'll have that sometime after the 31st of January next year. But it does impose a constraint also, and I do think we have to be sensitive on that point. We've made it a priority to raise the threshold of personal allowance for income tax, taking 1.1 million people out of income tax, demonstrating our commitment to low earners. We've introduced a bank levy. I think that was absolutely the right step to take, reflecting the fact that there is an implicit guarantee for banks, as we saw in 2008. And that banks need to make a bigger contribution. And we have, again, rightly made great stress on tackling avoidance and evasion within the tax system. And if you look at HMRC's spending review settlement, additional resources have been provided to HMRC to tackle avoidance and evasion. So those are some of the factors that in any government in our circumstances has to look at fairness as well as looking purely at going for growth. But I think we've got a good record in this measure because we have taken a number of steps that clearly going to make the UK more competitive, reducing the corporation tax rate from 28% to 23%. Again, most economists would argue that corporation tax is an inefficient tax, and we've made great efforts to do something about it. Capital is mobile in a globalised world. By and large, most economists would argue that the greater share of the instance of taxation of corporation tax actually falls on employees in any event, and we've taken action to do something about it, even though it's not necessarily the point that you hear most on the doorstep. It's not necessarily the easiest road over there, even in southwest Hertfordshire. We've touched upon the reforms of controlled foreign companies. Again, not necessarily a populist measure, but one that should contribute to businesses domiciling in the UK as opposed to leaving the UK. We think businesses will be looking to move here because we provide a more attractive circumstances. Same with foreign branches. Not every economist supports it, but we've introduced the patent box, which will make the UK very competitive in particular areas where relating to IP, which can be particularly mobile. And I'd also touch upon the issue of administration that John mentioned, and the issue of finality for taxpayers. And we've been supportive, although they've often been unfairly criticised, we've been supportive of HMRC in engaging with businesses, listening to businesses, and trying to reach settlement with businesses, and not necessarily litigating everything. It is better at times to get the money in earlier and to provide some certainty to businesses. And the move towards customer relationship management within HMRC, which I'd be the first to acknowledge occurred under the previous administration, is one that we support and welcome. And certainly talking to larger businesses, I think there is a sense that the UK has a competitive advantage in terms of tax administration. There are other aspects, as Matt said in his earlier remarks, there are other aspects to tax. It's not just the burden, it's just not the rates, it is the way in which we do tax law, and Will and John have touched upon that, and tax policy making paper, a new approach, as it was described, I think has improved our tax policy making process enormously. And that we now have to give a typical process, we might have an announcement in the budget, in consultation over the summer, draft legislation produced in early December before then enacting it in the finance bill the following summer. All of that, I think, is a much more methodical process which gives businesses much greater certainty, gives taxpayers greater certainty. Of course, there will be exceptions. Rates sometimes have to be changed more quickly, and sometimes there is a need to find additional revenue in something of a hurry. So it's not an absolutist approach. We think it's very much a step in the right direction. And we've also touched upon simplicity, and I'm delighted that we formed the Office of Tax Simplification, and John is doing some splendid work in that to make it easier for people to pay their taxes, to make it a better process, and the complexity doesn't get in the way. And alongside that, I would make this point about greater tax transparency. It's a particular issue that I'm very focused on, how we can make it easier for both businesses and also individuals to understand exactly how much tax they are paying. And you know, I hope that we will be moving in future to people having online tax accounts so they can see exactly how much they have paid in a much clearer way. And that actually touches upon issues to do with income tax and national insurance contributions as well, is that there is a role, I think, for the contributory principle, but we should be clear that how much people are paying in tax and contributions overall, and NICs shouldn't be used as a way of concealing increases in personal tax. So that is a run through of what we're doing. There's more I could say. I could come up with a longer list of the various measures we've taken in the tax system, but I think we have shown a real commitment to making our tax system an asset for the economy, making it essentially a pro-growth tax system. Of course there are constraints, of course there will be rightly criticisms from economists saying you could do more of this and perhaps less of that and so on, and there will always be that debate, but I think over the last 18, 19 months or so, as a government, we've shown a firm commitment that tax can be an asset to our economy and to liability, and that we have taken some steps that aren't necessarily populist, but are nonetheless the right thing to do to ensure that our tax system becomes the most competitive in the G20. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers for superbly sticking to time, which is a real achievement. Thank you very much. It means we've got plenty of time for questions, so I want to open it up straight to the floor. And any questions, if you could just say who you are, where you're from, and which panellists, if any, you'd like to respond.
That was quick. Hi, my name is Lawrence Hooper. I'm from the Legatum Institute. I have a question which, obviously the whole discussion is about tax and growth. I'm wondering, what does the panel think about the idea of actually the nature of growth? I think growth is quite an ambiguous term in terms of what it actually means. But obviously we know it means an expansion of GDP, but in terms of what effect that has on actual ground real level. I'm just saying, does the panel think that the tax system should be used to try to influence the nature of growth, or whether that is something that is not of interest? Just a kind of more broad question about what they think the nature of growth, how do they think the nature of the tax system affects the nature of growth we encourage, and whether it's something that should be considered within tax policy?
Sure, so I guess that's tax as an instrument, whether it should be neutral, and I think a bit of what you were saying. So perhaps, Paul, you could take that first?
I think the quick answer is no, I don't think tax should be used to influence the nature of growth. I think that's, you get into desperate trouble when you start thinking about using tax as an instrument to grow in this way as opposed to that way. With the kind of high-level exceptions that I alluded to before. So in terms of the environment, then yes, clearly tax should be used to tax the externality that is created by congestion or carbon emissions or what have you. One of the kind of depressing things actually about the way that we currently tax carbon emissions is, well, you can kind of understand why the tax system over 200 years has grown up in a kind of, piecemeal and ineffective and complex way. What's really rather depressing is that we've had carbon taxation for about 10 years and it's just as piecemeal and ineffective and sort of complex as any other tax system. So I've put that to one side. But my general no, I don't think tax should be used to, beyond the big externalities like the environment, I don't think you should try and use tax to increase manufacturing or reduce financial services or increase small business or big business or what have you. Now, there are elements of the tax system which currently create the almost perverse effect. We do under-tax financial services because they are VAT exempt. We also create massive complexity in financial services because they're VAT exempt. So there are issues within the current tax system which create kind of distortions in the way that we grow. But my view is kind of as a rather sort of, perhaps ivory tower sort of economist, we should not use the tax system in general to have that kind of effect.
It's a great economist view by the politician.
Well, actually, I have quite a lot of sympathy with what Paul is saying. I think there is always a danger of trying to overwork the tax system, trying to get too much out of the tax system and to use it in a way that is too prescriptive. Now, of course, there are plenty of exceptions, and Paul's right to raise environmental taxes, and one can find other areas, if you're looking at excise duties and so on, where there is a combination of trying to influence behaviour and also raise revenue, and then sometimes there can be tensions between the two. And no government is going to be sort of perfect in dealing with trying to achieve a fully neutral process. And there are areas where, for example, there could be described as externalities that aren't incorporated, and one could make a case, for example, for R&D tax credits. Is here an area where the tax system is used, but that's partly because R&D doesn't get sort of fully reflected for those incurring the expenditure. But I would always tend to argue on the sort of cautious side about trying to do too much. Of course, the temptation for politicians to be too prescriptive is quite strong, but I think we do need to demonstrate some restraint on that.
Will, do you have any views?
I mean, the theory of that is absolutely right. There's also a practical reason as well. And it's become very attractive over the past, again, 10 or 15 years to use credits essentially as a form of spending. But by doing it through the tax system, it looks like it's something slightly different. And in fact, what you're doing there is you're simply making the tax system considerably more complex and much more distorted as well, because you encourage certain types of behaviour. When I worked in the government, we used to, when we were at least trying to push back on this, sometimes we always lost, but when we tried to push back on it, said, if you want to give somebody some money, write a check. Don't do it as a credit, because you mess things up more. I just wanted, there are 2 points that Paul made very quickly. One is this question about financial services being under-taxed. In the current environment, people think that means banks aren't paying enough tax. As a general point, it is possible that financial services are being under-taxed. I can assure you, as a company which has at least part of it, which is a financial services company, we pay actually a fairly considerable amount of irrecoverable VAT, which means that we're actually paying quite a lot of VAT. I'm always a little cautious of that one. On the green growth stuff, again, I think that's right. You can use that for the big externalities, but also I think another thing we do have to bear in mind, and this again gets to the point of actually there should be a more straightforward way of doing this. But nevertheless, okay, tax the externalities, that's fine. But if you do genuinely want to encourage a type of behaviour which is currently uneconomic, you are going to have to find a way of paying for it. And therefore, if you want to, in order to encourage certain types of green technology, you're going to have to provide a carbon price floor. And whether you do that in a straightforward way, or whether you do that through the tax system, you have to get there. And the answer, as you probably know, is a mix of both. But you can occasionally move beyond that without picking winners and losers. I agree, micro winners and losers is an absolute nightmare.
John, any thoughts?
Just briefly, I mean, much of it's been said, but as I said when I was speaking, the job of tax, I think, is not to get in the way, first do no harm, etc. So I don't think it's the job of the government, the tax system, to try and pick winners or whatever. But if there is going to be some incentive or some distortion, as Paul's talked about, for environmental or particular types of business like the R&D, one of the things I would always plead for is that gets reviewed at reasonably regular intervals to see if it's working. we have a habit in this tax system of putting, this country's tax system, of putting something in place and, right, that's it, now let's move on to the next one, rather than looking to see if what we did is actually working. And I mean, some of our taxes have been in place for quite a while. You know, income tax famously since something 98 or 9, whichever you want to say. And you know, there's still vestiges of 1803's reintroduction of it in the tax system. You know, sometimes it needs looking at. You know, so I think a bit of reviewing can sometimes help more than trying to create new incentives.
Can I just add a couple of things on just what Will said very briefly? One, there is a tendency for government to think it's government as a whole, and particularly other departments, to think that there's an easy way of they want to achieve something but can't afford the money, so perhaps if they lobby for a tax relief, that is one thing that one has to watch for. But actually on R&D tax credits, some of the proposed reforms that we announced last week, and looking at R&D tax credits being above the line, would end up with it being reclassified as public spending as opposed to a tax cut, and so in that sense one could argue being more transparent.
There's a question just here, and then one right at the back over there.
My name is Sudhir Janak from KG Econometrics. We're an energy, environment, modelling consultancy. Just picking up the points that Paul Johnson made about what sort of growth you have, how you can encourage green growth. Of course, there is a summit at the moment in Durban, which is looking at climate change and looking at long term. What sort of policies should the government adopt to encourage green growth? For example, you have distortions, for example, the VAT on domestic energy at 5%, which makes no sense whatsoever. And at the same time, the government has said that it wants to raise the share of environmental taxes in the total tax take. What sort of measures will the government actually take to make sure that does occur and the externality which relates to carbon is limited?
Perhaps just take that question and answer them both together.
Charlie Napier here from the Freelance and Contractor Services Association. Interested by Mr. Whiting's point about not seeing PAYE and NICs ever being fully amalgamated. Just, I suppose, want to know whether the Minister agrees with that idea. And a sort of short plea, really, I guess. You know, we talked about big business and you talked about small business right at the beginning, but smallest businesses are obviously self-employed, freelancers, and so on. So, you know, really a plea to consider them always in your sort of tax considerations, because tax is a key part of why people do choose to become freelancers. And you know, 1.4 million of them and growing at the moment. And I think they're probably the engine of how we're going to get out of the economic mess we've got.
Cool. Two questions. One on green growth and policies to encourage it, and then alignment of tax and NICs. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll just just specifically on the points about VAT on domestic fuel, and I'm sure Paul would argue strongly in support of raising that. I can tell you that my first experience of canvassing was around about 1993, just after Norman Lavant, I think, had announced that we put it up to 17.5% or so. And that was an experience that I won't forget. And there was one particular, I remember, it was Newbury by-election, where I think one of the safest Conservative seats was defeated by about 20,000 votes. So there is a sort of sense here of you know, let's work within the political constraints. So on what we're trying to do on carbon price floor and so on, trying to provide some degree of certainty to it. I mean, I think moving away from you know, direct taxes towards in a way a consumption tax, there's a case for it, and I think Geoffrey Howe coined the phrase "move from pay as you earn to pay as you burn," and there is something to be said for that. But you know, there is clearly more work that needs to be done. We also have to recognise, let's be honest, that we could, in dealing with green taxes, we could achieve nothing more than move energy-intensive users out of the UK to another jurisdiction, not doing anything to reduce global carbon emissions, and essentially price the UK out of particular industries. And that's why we announced what we did last week with regard to intensive energy users. Just quickly moving on to the issue of freelancers. I mean, I'm struck by the point you said there's a lot of people who become freelancers because of the tax. And I think that probably would offend the principles of neutrality that we were talking about there. I think there is a real case for recognising the administrative burden that is placed on very small businesses and self-employed and so on. Probably John can say more about that than I can. But I wouldn't be keen to have a tax system that did try to drive people from being incorporated or unincorporated, self-employed or employed. As much as possible, we want to tackle that. Now, which brings me to the next point. I think there is a role for the government thinks there is a role for the contributory principle. We shouldn't discard that carelessly. But I think there are 2 points about NICs and income tax. One is that it is a burden on employers to administer 2 taxes, or a tax and a contribution, which are taken out of people's salaries and are there to be gains to be made there, which is something that the OTS is prompting, this government is exploring. And George reiterated that in his autumn statement last week. The second point about NICs and income tax is that very often it is not transparent, that it is a way of increasing taxes on personal income without people particularly noticing. And that isn't right, and I think there are ways in which we can, I touched upon that in your online tax accounts and so on, there are ways in which we can address that point without necessarily fully, address both those points without fully abolishing national insurance contributions.
John, do you have any views? I mean, one question I'd like to kind of raise is whether we can maintain a contributory principle whilst actually going further to get just one tax on personal income.
Yeah, I mean, David and I discussed contributory principle at length, and we don't necessarily fully agree, but the great thing is that we're looking at the 2 taxes, and I think the great thing is to bring them together. So fundamentally, we've got the same calculations, the same definition of income and things like that, and we understand where the differences are, and differences and contributory principle is there for a reason. And again, harking back to my historical point, the contributory principle probably dates from 1909 and Lloyd George. It's worth looking at again. It's kind of moved on.
1909 would have been land value taxation.
Yeah,
well, that was the first contributory principle to get into a stamp for your old age pension, but I appreciate that. But it's something that I think we could look at. And in terms of the points made about the freelancers, I mean, one of the things we're looking at with small business is, it may seem an obvious point, but what does everybody understand by small business? And if you look at the EU definition, that's virtually taking you up to companies quoted on AIM and things like that. In OTS, we started talking about nano businesses because we want to show we're trendy and things like that. But, it's pretty small ones and the sort of things that I think the gentleman was sort of asking about. So we do really focus on the one-person business or very small business and try and make it as easy as possible for them. And another way we might well come back and look at it is to say, okay, well, you could work as an employee, you could work as self-employed, or you could work as a freelancer, and should we have actually not 2 but 3 different types of tax? I mean, that's something we may well come back to, but give us a chance, we'll get there. But I think we're very well aligned to the different things and the need to encourage freelancing and, again, not to get into it. I'll leave others to talk about green taxes.
Just 2 things very quickly. On the contributory principle, yes, there is a case for a contributory principle in the sense that if I know that what I'm paying in national insurance or tax is buying me something in the future, then that kind of tax will have a less problematic effect on incentives and behaviour than one that doesn't do that. But the reality is there is no contributory principle at the moment. There is no relationship of any kind between what I put into the national insurance and what I get out at the end. By far the biggest thing that supposedly is related is the pension. It is almost impossible to avoid getting a full pension at the moment under the current circumstances. There is no contributory principle under the situation that we have at the moment, and it does create exactly the issues that David was referring to in terms of the opportunity for government to say, we're now going to raise income tax and then raise national insurance, which is certainly what happened after the 2001 election in exactly those terms. So there is a case of contributory principle. We don't have one. Second point is that on the green taxes, I think two issues. One around VAT on fuel. Now, David's absolutely right. I remember 1993 extremely well. It was a very kind of depressing experience from the point of view of a tax geek who wanted a rational tax system. There is a problem about the way that we talk about tax, and there's a problem about what we refer to quite specifically in the Merley's review as the tyranny of the status quo. It is a fairer system in which there is a tax on fuel, and people are compensated for it because those who happen to want to use lots of fuel don't get subsidised by everybody else. But moving from here to there is extraordinarily difficult. There's no question about that. In terms of the overall level of taxes, green taxes, I do think it is a shame that we have a situation in which, for example, if I heat my house using gas, there is no tax of any kind on the carbon emissions from that gas. If I'm a business using electricity created by burning gas, that's about a £45 a tonne of carbon dioxide tax on that, and there's every kind of a conceivable amount of tax in between those two things. That's not a rational or good system. It's also not one that meets what you want to really be concerned about in terms of international competition. You might think you'd be worried about the tax on business more than ones on households. Now, again, I understand the politics of why we end up there, but it's not actually a very good place to have ended up.
More questions? Let's take the kind of three that we had first, so you next time, so just 1, 2, and then 3. Just behind in the pink and blue.
My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm from EEF, the Manufacturers Organisation. I just wondered if there were any comments on how the tax system handles the depreciation of plant and machinery, and whether changes that government's made, particularly on the main rate, have been moving in the right direction or not.
Techie one. The chap just in front.
David Whittaker from Manchester's Treasury. It's certainly a noble aim that the UK should have the most competitive corporation tax regime in the world, but it doesn't preclude a situation where other countries would reduce their CT rate as well. Do you foresee a situation where a race to the bottom would involve countries considering a more efficient form of tax to replace corporation tax, and what would that be?
And the third one, just the one.
John O'Connell from the Taxpayers Alliance. I just, in the academic literature, there's evidence that countries with decentralised tax systems have stronger rates of growth. Is that something the Treasury is looking at, genuine fiscal decentralisation? That's a question for Mr. Gauke, and it would also be interesting to hear the panel's views on that.
Three controversial questions. Who wants to go first? Will, you got any thoughts on these?
Yep. Actually, I have thoughts on all three of those. First, on the depreciation of plant and machinery, this is one that David and I have talked about in the past, and I'm not going to deviate from my position, David, which is that I think so long as what we do relates to timing changes, and I think if you move towards, the closer you move towards the accounting, essentially sort of the financial depreciation, then I think that's fine. I think if you're talking about abolishing whole classes, as happened with the industrial buildings allowance, I think in retrospect that was a mistake, not your mistake. And I think that we had an infrastructure announcement the other day. I think that was really helpful. It was relatively silent on tax, and this is still, in terms of competitiveness, we're not the most competitive country on that. I'll leave that point there. But I think we do need to think about capital allowances, and we do need to be careful about changing them too much. Again, in part because it goes to the expectations, but in part it also goes, you don't necessarily need the best rates, but you need to be somewhere in the middle of the pack, so that it's not sort of the killer factor. And I think sometimes, with some really good projects, I think it does have value. In terms of competitiveness and the race to the bottom, this is a subject which comes up, and there are elements of that. And again, we've talked about this in the past, and I think that a sort of laser-like focus on the statutory tax rate without looking at any other element is to miss the whole picture. It can be a very expensive way of missing the whole picture, because what makes a tax system competitive is, yes, it's clearly the rate, but it's not just a statutory rate, it's the effective rate as well. But it's not just that, it's how does the administration work? How does the process work? When you come here, I mean, I'll take a different example. When you go to Ireland, you walk off the plane, and the IDA wraps its arms around you, takes you off to see the revenue, takes you off to see the Department of Finance. They welcome you. That doesn't happen in every country. So there's a whole raft of things which go into making up competitiveness. It's not just about that. But if you're talking about, is there another system? Well, the economists will tell you much more. The corporate tax system is about the worst way of really raising money and sort of interacting with the economy. If you wanted to do it, you move everything to a consumption tax. Is that practical? No, it clearly isn't. So there has to be some balance there. The decentralized tax system, this one I do want to address, and I'm going to shift hats here. I'm going to put on I'm also chair of the CBI Tax Committee, and we have been discussing this recently in relation to Northern Ireland and in relation to Scotland. And my view is very much that if you have a unitary country and you start trying to play around with significant differentials in the tax rate between various parts of that country, you will create a whole lot more trouble than any benefit that you might cook up. Because you're going to, how are you going to cope with this? You're going to have internal transfer pricing. You're going to try and ensure that countries don't have a brass plate in Edinburgh. Sorry, countries don't have a brass plate in Edinburgh or in Belfast. I think that's a mistake. A decentralized tax system, if you're talking about business rates, well, that's a different issue perhaps. But if you're talking about corporation tax, I don't buy that.
John, your thoughts?
Yes, again, I'd comment on all three at length. I mean, on depreciation on plant, I've always felt that if we were starting from scratch, we would never invent capital allowances. We've just got tax deductible depreciation. But again, it's something I've looked at for many years, and again, David and I talked about it in previous lives and all the rest of it. And I think there's a strong element of we are where we are. So the system is there. Echo Will's point totally about IBAs and the like. Let's at least keep a reasonable system. One point I would make, though, is that I've heard a lot from unincorporated businesses, and no, I'm not just thinking of accountancy practices, who grumble that the corporate tax rate has been reduced and paid for by reductions in capital allowances. Actually, the main people who grumble at me are farmers in the farming community and that sort of stuff. And they feel rather badly done to. So I do sometimes think that aspect hasn't been thought of, but much as I'd like to get rid of capital allowances, I think we are where we are, we'll stick with it. Corporation tax, I'll support everything Will said. I think really what the Treasury have to do is just bear in mind that there is something of a race to the bottom, or at least a reduction, and think what that means. We aren't there yet. Decentralised tax systems, yes, having been involved quite a lot with Scotland bill and now Northern Ireland, I found that a very interesting question, and I found the discussions on Northern Ireland corporation tax very instructive in that when we, Chartered Institute of Taxation, tried to say, this isn't a one-way bet, Reducing the tax rate in Northern Ireland does not automatically generate lots of extra revenue. And by the way, reducing the tax rate and creating a breakup of the unitary tax system does create extra admin. We have loads of bricks thrown at us. I mean, this seems, awful. How could you say that? Because obviously it was going to be a good thing. Well, I'll leave that thought with you. I mean, it's possible, but if you want to do it, you have to bear in mind these things are not one-way bets, and fundamentally you do get a lot of extra admin. If you want lessons on admin for lots of break-up, decentralised system, talk to the Australians sometimes. They've got quite a good lesson there.
Paul, any thoughts on?
But only very briefly, on corporation tax and the race to the bottom, people have been worrying about this for a very long time, and it may happen at some point, but we still raise the same proportion of national income in the UK and most other countries as we were doing 30 years ago in corporation tax. It's a remarkable fact, and it's something that I think, were we having this conversation 30 years ago, we would have been astonished by anyone who stood up and said that that's where we've been, but that's where we are. It must remain the risk that stops happening, but whilst it is feasible, I'm sure it will continue to happen, despite what Will quite correctly said, which is in a sense a more efficient way of doing this would be through a uniform consumption tax. And if we lose the corporation tax, that should be the place that we want to go.
Okay, on depreciation, I think you're right to say there's been a long-term trend in this particular direction. Governments of both colour have made depreciation rates less generous, and that has been used to fund reductions in headline rates. But I think you also have to look what we've done with short life asset regime. So I think the desire is to move something that is perhaps closer to the accounting treatment without necessarily going all the way, because there are some issues with that. On the race at the bottom, I entirely agree with what Paul said. As a race, it's a pretty slow race, but there is a logic to it. I mean, it is capital is mobile in an open economy, globalised world. And, let's hope that all of that will continue. It is an inefficient tax. In truth, it has an impact on it. The advantage of corporation tax and why perhaps it hasn't there hasn't been a real race to the bottom is that politically nobody really understands who pays it, who bears the instance of it. And that therefore around the world makes it a difficult one to cut. And for that reason it will probably be around for some time. But would it be replaced by something more efficient? Almost certainly, because there's not much that's less efficient. As far as a decentralised system is concerned, I think some taxes lend themselves more to another. We've got carbon commission proposals for Scotland, and looking at income tax and so on. There are some real issues with corporation tax. The impacts as far as the administrative burden is concerned, the difficulties of profit shifting and brass plates and so on. We are exploring the issue with Northern Ireland, and there are particular factors that exist with Northern Ireland because of the legacy of the Troubles, because there's a very small private sector, the fact that it doesn't share a land border with anywhere else in the UK, but does share a land border with the Republic of Ireland that obviously has a very different regime with different rates. So there are some particular factors that apply with Northern Ireland. But whether we're looking at Northern Ireland or Scotland, we also have to be aware that there is something that we would lose if we broke up a unitary system. We need to fully understand that.
We've got time for a final round of questions. There's one here, and then a gentleman there, and then a gentleman at the back. Just at the front.
Bill Dodwell from Deloitte. Is property undertaxed in the UK? We don't tax foreigners who buy and sell it. The council tax is a much lower levy than the old rates used to be. Should we do something different there?
And the gentleman just...
Thanks. Hello, my name is Gauke Thompson. I feel totally out of place. I'm a theatre director and writer. I've been researching the economic history of the National Theatre, and what has started to become a major part of my project is the 1909 People's Budget. And it just seems madness that we don't tax land values, that we do all these other things that inhibit growth when taxing land values would promote growth. And I appreciate, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'd appreciate all of your just comments on why that didn't happen.
Plenty of support from lots of economists here, so you're in a place at all. And there's a final gentleman at the back.
Hello, Jack Reynolds from the Ministry of Justice. We live in ever more increasing, a society with ever increasing inequality. What is the role of taxation in making society more equal? What are its limits, and is there one particular kind of taxation which is effective in targeting inequality?
three really good questions there. Well, two around land tax and property tax, and then one on a bit of what Paul was saying about progressiveness. So perhaps, Paul, you can kick us off with that one.
Blimey, well, those are three big issues to raise at the end of the evening. So it encapsulated in Bill's little question about is property undertaxed or not is an enormous amount of an enormous number of issues. So how should you think about taxing property? Well, you should think about taxing domestic property and business property quite differently. Is point number one. When you're thinking about taxing domestic property, you need to think about it in two ways. Domestic property is something you consume, like it's a big consumer durable, so you should think about VAT. It's also an asset which grows in value and from which you get a return, so you should think about the taxation of savings when you're thinking about domestic property. So those are the two things you can think about when thinking about domestic property. So the council tax actually is not so different from what a VAT on the occupation of property would look like. So it's an annual charge on the value of the property. It deviates from it in the rather important way that it's regressive relative to its base. So it's the higher the value of your property, the lower the proportion of tax on it. So in my view, there's no question that in that sense, high value properties are undertaxed. Now again, politically difficult to do anything about that, I appreciate, but I think you are driven fairly clearly to that conclusion. In terms of thinking about property, domestic property as an asset, even more complicated in many ways. Actually, you're buying this stuff out of taxed income, and then you're not paying further tax on it. Well, that looks a bit like taxing as an ISA, and we don't generally think that's not a bad way to end up. But actually, if you make a big excess return on the property, there's no tax on that either. And so there is a case for having some form of tax on the capital gains to owner-occupied property. I think that's actually just impossible, because the only way you can do that is if you really believe that would always be there, and then that would require an incredible amount of political agreement. And I don't think that will happen. So I think in a sense, the priority of property tax is almost certainly to reform council tax so that it's proportional to the value of the property rather than regressive in the base. And I understand why that's difficult. The question on land tax, well, you're absolutely right. It is a very efficient way of raising tax. I think it's probably unnecessary where it's domestic property, because if you have an effective council tax of the type I've just described, which actually reflects the current value of the property rather than the value as it was 20 odd years ago, then a lot of the value of the property is actually wrapped up in the value of the land. I mean, the reason that a 3-bedroom house in London is worth many times what a 3-bedroom house in other parts of the country is worth is because of the value of the land. So that's not a bad proxy for a land value tax. I said earlier that the important point is to distinguish business property from domestic property. We have a very inefficient system of business rates, which taxes the property rather than the land that businesses use. It would be much more efficient to tax the land value. It would also be much more efficient to tax the value of farmland. And John mentioned farmers complain that farmers actually do pretty well out of the tax system, where you think about business rates or inheritance tax, all sorts of other bits of the tax system. So yes,
farmers and policy exchange, you shouldn't be saying that.
It's actually a very good example of non-neutralities which result in people buying farms in order to avoid inheritance tax or what have you. It's a very efficient capital tax system, but it's not getting to farming. Well, perhaps we should get into farming to avoid the tax. So you're absolutely right. I think it's a very strong case for a land value tax for business, for non-domestic property. And for domestic property, then it should be, if the domestic property includes a large bit of land, and that counts as the value, then the council tax or equivalent charge on it should be very much higher than it is at the moment. So I think there's a strong case for that, but very clearly difficult to achieve it. When you're thinking about progressivity, I don't know what the answer is to kind of how much can the tax and benefit system bear in terms of reducing levels of inequality. I think there is a clear limit to what that can do. We have moved. So if you think about what's happened to inequality over the last 30 years or so, it increased very dramatically over the 1980s. Now, that was mostly driven by what happened in the labour market. Over the last 10 years, inequality has increased a little bit. almost exclusively driven by very big increases in incomes right at the top, by which I mean the top 1 or 2%. Across most of the distribution, inequality's actually gone down a little bit, and that's very much to do with tax credits for those in the lower middle part of the distribution pushing incomes up. But that came at a very high cost. I mean, I don't know what it's something like 20 billion of additional spending on tax credits. There is a very clear limit to the amount that you can achieve there. There's also a very clear limit to the amount that you can achieve in terms of taxing those right at the top. The capacity to move income to other countries or to convert it into capital gains or do other sorts of ways of avoiding tax for the very richest is substantial. And we don't know whether the 50p tax rate, for example, will be effective in that in that role. And whilst David mentioned that HMRC has been asked to evaluate that, well, I mean we're writing something on the 50p tax rate. And I think one part of it we'd like to call "Why I'm Glad I'm Not the Chief Economist at HMRC." frankly, you've asked him to do close to the impossible in terms of evaluating that effect by the 31st of January or whenever he wants it to be done. So there clearly is an important role for the tax and benefit system to reduce inequality. It should be done, to the extent it's done, through the direct tax system and through the benefit system, and not through savings tax, VAT, and other elements. But there is a limit to the burden that it can bear because of the opportunity, partly because of the effects of high marginal tax rates on incentives and growth, and partly because of the issues around avoidance that it creates. And I would not like to say how close we are to those limits.
I think that was a problem inviting the head of the IFS and the ex-chief microeconomist of the Treasury to speak, is that basically it's answered all the questions for everybody, and it's just, that's the answer. So, but because of that, I'll add a slightly additional question to the speakers as we go this way. In 2020, if we're going before 2020, if you wanted one tax reform, what would it be? And perhaps well, you could talk about land and property, and then you'll give your one tax reform by 2020.
So I'll see if I can talk about land and property. Think what the tax reform is.
Sorry, that's rude.
No, not at all. I mean, on land and property, I think we all instinctively feel we don't have it right. I am going to defer to Paul on the fine points of that. I mean, the one thing I would say is, yes, I think the business rates are not a great way of, at least for business, of taxing the use of land and property, relatively speaking. And it's worth looking at that. For the rest, there's no way I'm going to get to the personal tax side of this. On progressivity, again, I'm not going to address that because that, I think, in the end is much more, at least that actual aspect of it is much more about individuals. And obviously it veers into business tax when you're talking about capital gains and the ability of certain people, certain classes of activity, essentially to shift what is employment income into capital gains. That's a question which I think we need to look at. The one thing I would say on this, and this is more of a personal note than anything else, is that the worst thing that can happen to a tax system is that people lose faith in the fairness of it. And that is a perception thing. It's not an absolute number. And if you look at Occupy LSS, if you look at the whole Occupy movement, you can disagree with the way they go about things. You can say they're really not specific about what they're saying. They have raised some fundamental questions, which I think we need to address. And some of the answers to that may come through the tax system. And I think we just need to be open to that. Because if people lose faith in the tax system, people think that people right at the top are not paying their fair share, whatever fair means, then we're in real trouble, because then the whole thing crumbles. So I think we do need to bear that in mind. Okay, one reform. Firstly, I would make VAT more comprehensive, and I would try and do away with as many of the reduced rates as we could do. I think it's from a pure policy point of view, it is a nonsense to have all those things. From a political point of view, it's absolutely impossible. Would you ask me? You gave me a magic wand just from that.
Thank you. John, in 1 minute.
Fine.
Sorry.
No. Property tax is We ran a round table at the Institute a couple of weeks ago. Paul was there, and I think one of the biggest messages that came out of that is that property taxes have grown up higgledy-piggledy. They're not, that the archetypal example of taxes haven't been designed. What it needs is a good look at with some clear decisions, frankly political. What do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? Be it land value tax or whatever. And that might help us reform and get rid of or modernise a tax, for example, the transaction tax that had its roots in 1694, which was the origins of stamp duty. So, maybe again, scope for bringing it today. Equality, inequality, one example there, VAT on children's clothing, which of course is always the shining light of how that makes the system fair, except of course those who benefit are those who can afford to buy lots of clothes. So would it be better to tax children's clothing and give the money to those who really need it through greater benefits? Well, yes, I think it probably would, but it would be a brave minister who did that. And in terms of my reform, well, obviously in a sense I started something with PAY and NRC, so perhaps I better stick to that, but actually I'd probably echo Will's on VAT as well.
David, final word?
Right, well, very quickly on property taxes. Bill, you asked, do we tax it enough? I mean, by international standards, actually, we raise quite a lot from property taxes. But I hear the arguments and including from the other aspiring tax geek in the room. I mean, it's worth pointing out. What do you do if you're faced with the cash poor, property rich, the widow in the big house? One could take a view, right? Well, she should sell up or whatever. That's not an easy message to take out. So I mean, Paul touched on it, but that's why there are limits to how far you can go on property taxes, whatever the economic arguments may be. On inequality, if you try to overwork the tax system, you can run into some problems. You can damage work incentives, and it's quite striking that sort of the Scandinavians spend a lot of money, but they've actually got, I think, Paul correctly, but in economic terms, they've got a pretty efficient tax system, and they deal with these matters through a generous benefit system. But then, if you do that, do you start running into problems with work incentives at the bottom end? And how cleverly do you need to design that? And actually, do the Scandinavians get away with it because of a very strong work ethic, but probably can't be replicated elsewhere? I'm not sure. I mean, that's the challenge there. So I think up to a point, the tax system can be used. It is used. It is striking that for example, the top 1% of income tax payers contribute something like 27% of income tax. But so far, we can only go so far. As for the area of reform, well, as a government minister with some responsibility in this area,
perhaps your wife's answer.
Perhaps I should have my wife's answer. Instead, I will give something that we just floated, a week or so ago, but was touched upon already, was moving towards a more transparent system, a system that is clearer for people to understand, so that they know exactly where they stand. It's not a policy reform; it's about administration, it's about presentation. But this is a process that will take a number of years, but I think there's a lot of progress to be made there.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for, sadly. I've never heard in one seminar on tax it called sexy and trendy in the same place, so I'm quite shocked and pleased. And just leaves me to say a couple of things. One, please do read the document which we published a couple of weeks ago, Looking to the Future of Growth. It's got a chapter from Will and also suggestions on policy change ideas about how to introduce better stability and transparency to the tax system. So do have a look at that. And with that huge plug, I'd like to thank our speakers, John, David, Will and Paul. And of course, thank G for sponsoring. And then to thank the speakers in the usual way.